What's up, everybody? This is Professor Keegan, and just a quick video today because I know you have a film also assigned, and I would really like you to have time to get to it. So I won't talk too much. I just want to give you some framing context for how the readings and the film for this week work together. And so we are still in our unit on unlearning myths of gender. We discussed last session that we were together about how the gender system we have in the United States was actually brought here by white European colonizers who then imposed it as a system of hierarchical control on indigenous people, African slaves, and also kind of like everybody else who kind of came into the nation as it formed. And so I wanted you to be thinking in that unit about how gender is kind of another tool by which social control is maintained and a kind of hierarchy of expression is enforced in the United States that goes all the way back to the foundation of this nation through settler colonialism. Um, in this second week of this content, we're looking at how gender and sexuality interface with other kinds of issues. So the reading for last class, the Claire reading, talks about how sort of LGBTQ identity and ableism tend to work together, like how disability and gender can work together. So I'm curious to see what you'll do with that reading. Today, we're reading a little bit more about masculinity as a specific type of gender expression. And then I'm having you watch a film called Minding the Gap that takes us through the lives of some young men in the Midwest and their struggles around class, education, race, and gender. So this is Unlearning Myths of Gender. I have my wallpaper and slide up here, cute little girl, big strong boy. What's the difference? As I discussed last class, social construction shows us how we make and remake gender around these ideas of normative behavior. And we kind of box people in even before birth into these stories about how their genders are supposed to work with things like gender reveal parties. Just a couple slides here to kind of get you back into the material. You'll remember that last session I showed you this model of the traditional gender binary model. And we looked at the different layers of this model: biological sex, which is your bodily characteristics; gender identity, or your sense of self, your sort of psychological identification; gender expression, which is your actions; and then sexual orientation, which comes kind of at the bottom of this system, who you're attracted to. And we talked about how the more you cross this yellow line, kind of the worse off you get in US culture, because you're violating the system that's set up to kind of police these categories and kind of ensure that everyone ends up heterosexual. Um, so one thing to notice here is how these middle layers of the system are about gender. So there's sex, right, your body, and then there's your sexual orientation, who you're attracted to. But how does one turn into the other? There's a middle to this that's about gender identity and how we're supposed to perform gender in order to keep assigned sex, right, the sex we're given by a doctor, right, and sexual orientation in line. So gender identity becomes like the glue in the system. And that's why there's actually so much pressure around gender. You'll notice that like gender norms are more deeply ingrained at a younger age, even sometimes before birth, than anything like sexual orientation is enforced. There's less room even for gender expression and diversity in our culture than there is for sexual orientation. And that has a lot to do with the fact that gender is kind of like the glue keeping everything together. And therefore, there's not really a lot of gender variation permitted in this traditional system. Last session, we talked about indigenous North American cultures and how they had much more range of gender expression. And colonizers did not like that. They targeted gender nonconforming indigenous people because they threatened the sense of patriarchal control or male control over other people that the colonizers believed in. So Today, I want you to be thinking a bit about the middle of this system, and we're going to be working through how that shows up in people's lives when we look at Minding the Gap. So I wanted to talk a bit about the idea of gender polarity or complementarity, which is an idea that comes along with this kind of alignment we're all supposed to follow, where traditional gender stereotypes enforce this idea that men and women are opposites and that therefore they require one another, right? So gender complementarity is the idea that one gender completes the other gender, and therefore straightness is necessary because without it, you don't have all the characteristics of a complete person. So as you can see here, traditional gender stereotypes for men or masculine people, right? Aggressive, independent, dominant, active, not emotional, decisive, tough, right? These are all things we would associate with traditional masculinity in US culture and are all really promoted for boys. Whereas the pink category is, femininity for women or for girls, not aggressive, dependent, easily influenced, submissive, passive, indecisive, gentle, sensitive, right? Notice that these are not only traditionally associated with femininity, but they are the opposite of the qualities associated with masculinity, right? Um, so, men and women are understood in our system to not only be different, but different in opposite ways. And a lot of the gender policing we experience as people is related to this idea of complementarity or polarity, that there has to be strong difference between the genders and they have to complete one another in a unit. And that unit is usually imagined as like traditional heterosexual marriage. This idea of gender complementarity is one reason why some people think, even though there's no evidence of this, some people think that same-sex couples cannot properly parent because they don't have all the gender complementarity in their relationship. There's no data to actually support that idea, but it's an idea that comes out of this kind of system of gender stereotyping. So polarity, right, meaning two poles. We're taught that there are only two categories for gender, men or women, or men, masculine, feminine, that are determined by sex. Again, that would not necessarily be correct. We know that some people's genders do not line up with their assigned sex. That would be a name for trans people, or is a name for what we would describe those people as. So that's a myth. And then complementarity, right? We were taught that the two genders are natural opposites to one another and therefore require one another, which is another myth. And so these are myths we're constantly socially constructing around gender and sexuality. And if you notice how kids are socialized, we construct this for children to repeat also through toys and schooling and parenting and all kinds of things. So the gender binary of like man, woman here, which are the only two genders we have, or boy, girl, undergirds this idea or structure of heteronormativity. Heteronormativity is the idea that straightness is normal and natural, and in order to have that idea, we need two complementary genders, right? If we have three genders or four genders, like Native North American culture did, then heteronormativity falls apart because there's not just two genders that require one another anymore. And so that model I showed you, the binary model, doesn't work, right? So you can see how you need to get rid of other gender expressions in order to ensure that most people think of heterosexuality as like the only way to express themselves. So all of this is kind of wrapped up together in this normative system, this kind of mythic structure of gender and sexuality. So there are two ideal forms of gender in the gender binary. The first, and they're both mythic forms, meaning almost nobody can actually be this ideal gender because we all fail these standards in some ways. They're unreachable ideals, and yet we apply them to people all the time. So that's maybe a problem. For men, the ideal is hegemonic masculinity. hegemonic meaning or ruler or most powerful, right? The ideal form of masculinity in US culture. And this ideal really legitimizes men's dominant position in our society, which is a patriarchy in which men have more social, political, and economic power than women do. Women have been making gains, but the data will show you that men really do still control most of the economy, make more money, have more political representation. The Senate is not 51, 52% female, even though more than half of our population is female. So men are overrepresented. And this dominant form of masculinity justifies the subordination or oppression of women, and not just women, other less masculine men as well. So this is a model of masculinity that's about who has the most power, who can most ideally embody those complementary traits I just showed you, and everybody else is less valuable. So under this model, men are supposed to be tough and unfeeling, promiscuous, and to express ourselves through physical action and aggression rather than talking or sharing our ideas. And the other form of ideal gender is called emphasized femininity. And it's called emphasized because women are imagined to emphasize men. So there's hegemonic masculinity, right? And then there's like the supporting woman who comes in and kind of keeps that man elevated in the relationship. So in this ideal model, which I'm saying is not necessarily a great model for gender because it produces inequality, women are imagined as helpers to men, but are never actually in a position of leadership or authority themselves. So emphasized femininity is the ideal form, again, of femininity in the United States. Seen as a complement or completion, right? Supporting completion of hegemonic masculinity, emphasizes conventional beauty, smallness, physical smallness, passivity, and sexual availability. So these two things are imagined to go together and need and require one another. So they're mythic structures, meaning when we look around the world, almost nobody we know is perfectly one of these genders. Everybody kind of fails to be this gender because like men have feelings and women have ideas. So like it's kind of ridiculous that we're all held to these standards that don't exist in nature and don't seem to even socially exist outside of like their idealization in the media. So I had you do a really short reading from Michael Kimmel, who's a theorist of masculinity, about hegemonic masculinity. And he is really talking about how, you know, often we think that LGBTQ people and women are oppressed by gender and men are kind of coming out on top, straight men. But really, when you think about it, the way the system is set up actually affords men less flexibility in their gender expressions than women are afforded. So, you know, one thing to think about is like, how are men boxed in by all these expectations and maybe encouraged to engage in self-destructive behaviors because our culture doesn't give men any other way to safely express themselves without kind of like being made fun of. This is part of the problem with patriarchy because to be in charge, you have to always be strong and you have to always be fighting for your position. And so men actually have more pressure put on them to fight and maintain dominance all the time. And it can actually really affect your ability to feel good about yourself. Like men constantly compare themselves to other men. So there are especially rigid gender norms for men in US culture, such as men have to be more intelligent and successful than others. Men must always be stronger and more rational. Men must always be in control and never be vulnerable. And any emotion except for anger or pride is a form of weakness for men, generally speaking. And I'm not saying, again, I'm not saying these are true things. I'm saying these are myths. They're like widely kind of enforced and yet untrue. Masculinity in this mythic structure is the most valuable form of gender and should be defended at all costs. Like if someone insults your masculinity, you're supposed to attack them or defend yourself or destroy the other person somehow. Anyone who acts like a woman needs to be dominated or corrected to preserve the value of hegemonic masculinity, right? So you can see how, because of these attitudes, which again are not true, much of the oppression of women and LGBTQ culture, or people in our culture, actually stems from these kind of unstated beliefs about masculinity itself. That like anyone who can't act like this or isn't interested in acting like this is less valuable socially. So it's really important to think about that. I don't think we usually connect this idea of like the norms around masculinity to the experiences of people who fail these standards, and how that turns into like an experience of kind of collective oppression for different groups. So what Kimmel finds in his study is that, you know, we often think of homophobia or transphobia as being about sexuality. But Kimmel says that these are actually attitudes that are about gender, that this is about reinforcing gender rather than being scared of, say, gay people. Um, and so, you know, he's illustrating how it's not that homophobia isn't actually about the fear of gay people, it's about the fear of men who act like women. There's a gender boundary being violated there that a lot of people are uncomfortable with because of these gender norms that cause us to question hegemonic masculinity as a structure. So it's more about kind of violating that middle, that glue, that gender glue in the middle of the model than it is necessarily about just disliking gay people as a group or disliking trans people as a group. It's more about people who illustrate that the system doesn't have to be the way it is, and who violate those gender boundaries or gender myths and show like, look, there are other ways to be. There's a lot of pressure on those people to disappear or not express themselves so that other people can feel secure in their position. Secondly, Kimmel illustrates how much of sexual and gender performance internal to masculinity is not actually for women. Like women, if you talk to women, they're not actually necessarily attracted to hegemonically masculine men. It's not necessarily a behavior that is for women's consumption. Most of this masculine performance is actually for other men. That hegemonic masculinity is a performance to illustrate one's competence and dominance to other men. So it's all men competing with one another, and then everyone else being like, what are these guys doing? You know? So it really sets men up against each other. And I think a lot of men are really lonely because of this. Like there's a really high rates of like suicidality, depression, drug and alcohol abuse among men who really uphold these gender norms, because it means that you can never really have friends. You have to always suspect other men. You have to always be in competition with them. And it's actually pretty unpleasant to like live inside as a structure. Men die younger on average than women, and some of these norms are why. They put themselves in risky situations, they abuse drugs, right? When we get to minding the gap, I would ask you to think about like, how do maybe the Claire reading and the Kimmel reading set us up to understand some of the things that those young men are doing? Like, why are they responding to the situations they're in the way that they are? What are their coping strategies? And then also, what are some of the behaviors of the men in their families who are older? Like, what kind of like role models do they have in their families, and where are they learning gender from? And then how do we see them kind of playing that out and struggling with that? So I really would love for you to all watch this film. Please prioritize it. It's actually a fantastic documentary. It won an Oscar for Best Documentary a couple years ago. And I think it might speak to a lot of our experiences as people who live in the Midwest. And, many of us are from these small towns or small cities where there isn't much opportunity, right? And we see people struggling and coping with the conditions of that reality. Um, so one question to be thinking about as you view is like, why are these young men in the video or in the movie struggling so much? And what does this have to do with so many of the myths of American culture that we've studied in the first half of class? How do we see those myths showing up for these guys in their private and personal lives? I'd like you to think about myths of education, myths of class, myths of gender or masculinity. And we're getting to race next half of the semester, I think coming up next week, possibly. But, we have talked about the impact of race in various ways, right? So how are all these structures showing up for these men in ways that kind of limit their ability to get ahead or like have rewarding experiences or relationships? How are these myths impacting them? And then another question is, the title of this film is Minding the Gap. And I just wonder what you think that means. What gap? What is being referenced there? And what does it mean to mind the gap? This is a documentary about skateboarders. So there's always the gap you're jumping on a skateboard, but what about other types of gaps? What about generational gaps? What about gaps in communication? What about gaps in opportunity, right? I really would like you to think about that. And I really would like you to try to address some of this in your journal over the weekend. So I will leave it there. And I'm really excited to see what you think of this film. Hope you're all well.